Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Forgive Me Father 2. So I decided to come back to this and take a look at it again because it had a really sort of advantageous early access campaign, by which I mean there was a lot of changes that happened during that campaign, and it really altered the game a lot for the better, I would say, in terms of things like map design and enemy placement and stuff like that, but we'll get into all those details a little bit later. First off, what even is it? Well, this is a Lovecraftian FPS. A game in the boomer shooter mold, but instead of classically, fighting demons and stuff, you're fighting Lovecraftian entities from beyond the stars, and it's got this really nice sort of comic book art style to it. The first game had this art style as well, and it was one of its most standout features, but in this case, it's much more detailed and higher resolution. So in terms of how it looks great. You've got some really detailed enemies and some really nice environments, as well as really clever use of color. A lot of the color being things that highlight the paths you need to go and stuff like that. You may go into an area with tons of these greenish, tealish bookcases, and that is a nice way to add sort of a splash to the otherwise earth-toned brick environments. But then you'll see it decorated with like bright red bloodstains and other things like that, and it really comes together to create a sort of dread atmosphere, which I think is, that's what we're going for here. We're going for that classic Lovecraftian atmosphere of dread. So there's a lot of greens and reds in terms of eldritch things and things that are not meant to be seen, perhaps. And you'll also notice that the thing that's closest to the screen at all times, your weapon, has had a lot of attention and care put into it because they're all very detailed weapon sprites. They look odd. Pretty much all of them look weird. None of the weapons in this game are entirely normal. Even the most normal of them, like the revolver that you have from the beginning, is got like green slime coming out of the cylinder and stuff, so it's not quite a normal weapon, and you'll see that with pretty much all of the more standard weapons. But then you have all sorts of other much more creatively designed weapons as well that you can switch to if you want, that are just weird looking. They're like living creatures oftentimes. And many of them are weapons that were normal at one point underneath, but have been overgrown with some strange life form that changes how they work. And then there are others than that that are more like crazy sci-fi or weird ancient magic kind of stuff too. In terms of how the game sounds, soundtrack-wise, you got sort of a 50-50 split between ambient dread tracks, your sort of exploration music that is, a lot of it is environmental effects and very subtle. It's not like super loud music. The point of it is clearly to create atmosphere, and it does a very good job of that. But then you've got the more upbeat sort of metal or industrial tracks that happen when you're in large arenas and stuff. These don't pop up on every single fight necessarily, but they do pop up in your larger arenas or your bigger sort of ambushes and things of that nature, and they do a good job of, upping the ante, making things a little bit more upbeat, brightening up the soundscape with some more energy. And then you'll be switching back and forth as you explore and fight, and I think that was a good choice. I think the choice of making the sort of general exploration soundtrack, this more droning, atmospheric, environmental stuff, makes a lot of sense for the kind of atmosphere that they're creating here, and then, having things get suddenly more fast-paced and action-y sounding during the big arena segments and stuff, it kind of sets those moments apart so that the levels are kind of big arenas interspersed with a lot of exploration, some puzzle solving, some secret finding, and it gives the overall levels kind of an epic feel, I guess you could say, because they feel really long. Not in a bad way, they feel long in the sense that there's a lot that happens in any given level, and it feels like a very complete experience. Each level has a lot of different set pieces and arenas that are going to happen, as well as a significant amount of exploration and stuff, so the levels themselves feel very full and nicely developed. Mechanically, this is a pretty pure shooter. Most of what you're going to be doing is shooting. There's not a whole lot of other stuff like spell casting or anything like that, although there are a couple of other bits. First off, you've got 6 different weapon slots in this game, and each weapon slot contains a specific kind of weapon. So like one of them will always be a pistol sort of weapon, one of them will always be a shotgun, things like that. And you're going to have your entire arsenal relatively early, but you can expand it from there by finding these tokens. There are these purple shard-looking tokens that'll be around the place, and these are about half in obvious places where you're going to be progressing through major parts of the level, and the other half are going to be really obscure and difficult to find secrets. And then in between levels, you can go back to an asylum, and one of the NPCs at this asylum allows you to spend these tokens to unlock new weapons for each slot. So once you find that slot's weapon for the first time, you will then keep it, and then you'll be able to unlock any of the other weapons that can go in that slot that you want with tokens. So you can unlock them in any order that you want. And the way it tends to work is the weapons that you can unlock are not strictly better or worse than the main slot weapon that you find at first. They're just different ways of using that slot. Like, say, the rifle, which is a nice rapid-fire hit-scan weapon, pretty powerful, does good damage, but has a relatively heavy recoil, so you want to burst fire it generally. It's just a good weapon for like crowds of smaller enemies and stuff. But one of the weapons you can change it to is this living weapon that fires these sort of homing, boring insect bullets, as best way I can put it, that you can just fire up in a crowd and they will all home in on enemies all around you and start damaging them without you really needing to aim all that precisely. So you give up the ability to do reliable headshots and stuff with it, but it means that it's really hard to miss with it because you can just sort of fire into the air and these bullets will curve really sharply down towards enemies. So you're basically exchanging more reliable damage of the normal assault rifle for instead more of a sort of arena combat weapon that's specialized towards strafing around and dealing damage to large crowds without needing to aim specifically at any of them. And then there's, say, the grenade launcher, which is a really satisfying weapon to use. You can arc grenades with it over cover and barriers and bounce it off of walls and stuff. It has 4 shots in its drum and it's just a really useful weapon. But then you can change it to something like this crazy polyp creature thing that fires like a hit scan beam that causes an explosion whenever the beam hits. So you lose the ability to arc grenades with it. You can't fire it over stuff anymore since it fires in a straight line, but it does allow you to deliver explosions directly to an enemy at whatever range you want instantly. You've also got the exotic weapon slot. For all of the options for that are really cool. This is basically your BFG slot. It starts off with the obelisk, which is a crazy ancient weapon thing that's basically a railgun. It fires with a slight delay, but it shoots a beam that basically pierces through everything in a straight line all the way to the other end of the arena or wherever you're at, and does a huge amount of damage to everything in that line. But some of the stuff that you can change it to is pretty crazy, like that weird bloom gun thing, which sort of just disintegrates whatever's in front of it without firing any projectiles. It's just, you sort of hold it down and it dismantles everything that's in front of you. It's a really weird weapon, but it's very effective at dealing with pretty much everything. Although, as you would expect, it does chew through the exotic ammo really fast, so you've got to keep it fed. So I definitely like the weapon system in this game just because there's so much variety to it. Every slot has a lot of different things that you could possibly put in there. So it means you have a lot of different possible loadouts to choose from, and they're all really satisfying from what I've played. Pretty much every weapon has a nice bit of impact to it, and the sprites being really detailed and creepy, it definitely adds to the effect as well. You've also got the Dark Tome. You'll see a green gauge at the bottom of the screen that fills up in segments as you deal damage to enemies, and you can just smack shift to use one of these segments and use your tome power, whatever that is. And the other NPC that you can find at the asylum allows you to purchase and equip different pages, and the pages allow you to determine what this effect actually is. So you have active pages that will be used whenever you use the tome, and then you have passive pages that are just with you at all times, and you can have up to 3 pages total split between whatever ratio you want of active and passive. I particularly like the combination of the page that makes you take a ton less damage for a little bit and the page that makes you leech health with your attacks as a nice combination. And then I usually take one passive, which is often the one that lets you carry more ammo, because without it your ammo is pretty limited for most of your ammo types. But I would say the thing that was the most sort of advantageously handled during the early access was level design, because a lot of work has been put into making these levels really interesting but also navigable, because there were some concerns in the early stages of the early access where some people were getting lost very easily in some of the levels, and that's partially because the level design this time around is very labyrinthine and a bit confusing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but it was at first. The levels could be kind of difficult to navigate at first. And especially because a lot of them rely on getting colored keys and going back to previous areas to find colored doors, and sometimes it was easy to get lost in the tangle of trying to get back to where you were. And I played the original incarnation of all of the base levels, and then I played the newest incarnation of all the levels, and it's like night and day how different they are. You know, the overall layout is still the same, they're the same levels, but the way that they guide you and the way that they spawn enemies to make sure that you know where to go and stuff, it's completely different now. And the progression through the levels is a much smoother experience now. Basically, the levels have a significant amount of enemy spawns that lead you around. You know, it does a really good job of spawning enemies in the hallways that you're supposed to go next, or plopping an arena down in the room that you're supposed to go next, things like that, things that let you know where you're supposed to be going and make you understand that you're currently walking on the intended pathway. That was probably the most difficult part of it last time with the much earlier versions of these levels. It was difficult to know, is this area where I'm supposed to be right now or not? And they've kind of taken all that guesswork out while still managing to make sure the levels are complex and interesting to navigate. It's just that there's a lot more signposting and a lot more enemy spawns in terms of the places that you're meant to go next and how it leads you around the level, basically, so that I never really got lost in the new levels. They are still fun to navigate, they're just not as confusing. So I think, honestly, the level design and the flow of the levels is the biggest win for the early access, the thing that improved the most, the thing that they got the most really good feedback on and were able to use to craft a better experience. I think level design is way up there on that list. But the other thing, and probably my personal favorite thing about it, is the enemy design, because the enemies in this game are just well designed in general. They look really cool. A lot of them are really unsettling or creepy in different ways, but they have really detailed sprites that come apart in very visceral and disgusting ways, and they just look really neat. But it's not just how they look, it's the fact that they have very readable silhouettes and very obvious sound cues that are unique to each one, so you always know where they are and if they've spawned. After the first time you encounter an enemy and learn what they do, you'll pretty much burn into your brain their silhouette and the sounds they make when they're doing their thing, so that as soon as you see that or hear them again, you'll immediately know it's one of those guys. And the entire enemy roster has that effect, in my opinion, and that's a really good thing. Just as kind of one example that is like a microcosm of the way that the enemies are designed in this game, take the gas mask guy. The gas mask guy is very creepy looking. He's got a big bee-tentacled face, he glows green, and he's wearing like World War I era gear, it looks like, or something similar. He's a very unsettling looking enemy, but he also has a really creepy sound that happens around him that sounds like radio static. And no other enemies sound this way. He's also a very threatening enemy because he can take a fair amount of punishment, and he fires a chain of fast green projectiles that you really don't want to be hit by. And the firing sound that he makes is also different from the firing sound of other enemies, so you immediately know when he's around. But there are some enemies in this game that you don't want to headshot, because sometimes headshotting them doesn't just deal increased damage, it also changes how they work. And these guys are one of those. If you break their gas mask, they will let go of their weapon and instead become very fast melee enemies that'll rush you. And when they do this, the sounds they make are completely different to denote that they're in sort of melee mode. So even if you can't see them, you know that one of them has changed. It changes from like radio static to instead more like radio feedback, and it just sounds really unsettling. But because of that, you know when these guys are around, and because they're relatively threatening, it's important to know when they're around, and all of this is especially important when you're dealing with the later levels of many of the areas, which are super dark. Many later areas have a lot of darkness in them, and you have a flashlight that is infinite, but you gotta crank it. However, it only illuminates a small cone in front of you, which means in these dark arenas, you're probably gonna see maybe like 30% of the enemies or so, and the rest of them you're not gonna be able to see because they're gonna be out of the arc of your flashlight, which means you need these really good sound cues to tell you what enemies are around, because you probably can't see them all. And the same thing happens when you walk into a new room and you hear a specific enemy call. You now know that that particularly threatening enemy is somewhere in the room. It's just little touches like that that add a lot to the environments, because, well, some of these things could be kind of frustrating. Some of the enemies that are very threatening, if you didn't hear them coming or know their silhouettes, they could be seen as very frustrating enemies. But because they have these really precise cues and you always know where they are or know that they're there, that helps them not be frustrating, and instead it helps the atmosphere be quite tense instead. Basically, the sort of success of this game, in my opinion, is what I would call haunted house design. Basically, it's design where a lot of it is dark and you can't see everything, but there are some specific sound cues and some flashes of light that are meant to tell you what scary thing is coming your way. In a haunted house, what you can't see but can only hear is just as important as everything that you're taking in with your eyes. And they're using that atmosphere to basically direct a curated set of scares towards you. And that's exactly what this game does in terms of its level design and enemy design and stuff. So my opinion on Forgive Me Father 2 is that it's a really solid boomer shooter that does a lot of things right without too many extraneous mechanics leaning off of it or anything. A lot of its atmosphere and its weapon design and stuff is what sort of carries it and makes it satisfying to play, and it does a good job with its levels and its flow and progression and stuff to keep you going for a good amount of time. There's quite a few levels in this game, and they will take you a while to beat, so there's a good amount of content here too. I'll put the link in the description below this video if you wish to check this game out for yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.